All right, so we are live tonight. We're looking at 1 Samuel chapter 21, beginning. We're actually going to pick up in verse 4. But where we left off last time, obviously this section of Scripture is, and really for the majority of the remaining chapters in this book, David's going to be on the run, right? He's on the run because he's having to flee Saul. Obviously, we know that their relationship's not good at all at this point. We saw last week that after David and Jonathan had, basically said their farewells to one another, they unlike Saul and David, leave on a good term. We know that David obviously leaves. He flees south. I meant to have a map with me tonight that actually charts this out, but David's going to continue to flee south and to move farther west, especially when by the end of class tonight. We're going to try to get through the end of chapter 21, which is only about 12 more verses for us to cover, so that should be doable tonight. But David left Gibeah. That's where he had saw Jonathan, and he flees to the city of Nob in chapter 21. And one of the things that we note, of course, last week was, David fled to Nob because it was obviously south. It was farther away from Gibeah. And as we mentioned before, who is there in the city of Nob that is of particular interest to David? Yeah, the high priest, right? We noticed back in chapter 18 when David fled the first time, right? He fled to meet with Saul. Or fled to meet with Samuel, right? The messenger of God. He wanted God's advice. So, naturally, David, he flees to the city of Nob, which we've mentioned before. At this point, it's known as the city of the priests. Perhaps this is where the tabernacle is. And so, maybe in a sense, David's trying to get advice again from the high priest or those that are in charge of the religion of Israel, right? It's something that's wise to do, something that Saul is going to make another mistake on later on. But in chapter 21, David's obviously afraid. He went to Ahimelech, and Ahimelech wanted to know his business there. And as we pick up tonight, we're going to see that David is very much, if we looked at David's rushing. You've ever seen people that are rushing in life? They don't always think clearly. Perhaps that's the case with David tonight. Obviously, everything that they do doesn't seem like they have a lot of patience. And if you had to look at David as we see him in chapter 21, you would look at a man that is rushing to get where he's going. And we'll talk about the reason why that is the case tonight. So, chapter 21, looking at verse 3, the text says, "Now therefore, what is under thine hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in mine hand, or what is there that's present?" Right? So, David is simply hungry, right? He's a man that's on the run, naturally, didn't have time to gather supplies like he probably would have. And so, naturally, as we mentioned last week, you would be pretty hungry at this point. I don't know if we mentioned this last time, but, David being the son-in-law of the king, the king had certain expectations that the people would provide for him. And you see that back in 1 Samuel chapter 8, not in the way that David asked tonight about what he asked for, but being connected to the king's family, obviously you've got privileges there, and so David very much could make a request of this nature from the priest, and it wouldn't have been thought to be uncommon, the idea. So we note in verse 4, "The priest answered David and said, There is no common bread under mine hand, but there is hallowed bread. If the young men have kept themselves at least from women." All right, so I mentioned before why it's important to know Leviticus, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, the books of the law. And that's really going to come out into play tonight. All right, so the bread that they have, right, there is no common bread under mine hand, but there is hallowed bread. Again, the word common here just carries the idea of ordinary. And the contrast is with the hallowed bread would be bread that's holy, but bread at this point that's connected to that sat on the table of showbread that was in the holiest place within the tabernacle. And we'll mention more about that in a moment. Right, so that is what the bread that they have. We noted that the phrase under mine hand meant sort of like on your person, right? Ahimelech might have had bread in his house, but David wants to know what did he have on him right then. And obviously, being the high priest, obviously probably being the tabernacle here, the only food is the table of showbread. Now, one thing that I'll note here, Leviticus chapter 10, verse 10, the bread that was used for the table of showbread, it could not change purposes unless something happens, and we'll note what that is in a moment. But once the table of showbread was made, it was put there on when it was put there on the table in the holy place, not just an ordinary person, but any person connected to the tabernacle or temple could not just walk up one day and take that bread and eat it. You could not do that unless, we'll note the exception in a moment, but once the bread is put there, it was put there for a purpose, right? It was consecrated. So the point is that Ahimelech is not under the authority necessarily at this point to give David bread. Now, obviously we know that the bread was to be eaten by the Levites, but particularly David was not a Levite. He's not a priest. He didn't have right to eat of it. But nevertheless, Ahimelech offers this as a part. And so what he requires of David is basically that they have you kept yourself clean. If the young men have kept themselves at least from women. And basically the idea is there, David, if you and your servants that are with you have not been sleeping with your wives, then I can give you the bread, is what Ahimelech said. So this is where knowing the Old Testament comes into play. Leviticus chapter 15, verse 18. And we're going to look at a number of passages from the Old Testament, or from the law of Moses, that connect with this. But Leviticus 15, verse 18. The woman also with whom man shall lie with seed of copulation, they shall both bathe themselves in water and be unclean until the even. So the idea there is, obviously, if a man went in and slept with his wife, you would be unclean for the duration of that day. And that's what Ahimelech wants to note. One thing that another example you keep in mind with this is Exodus chapter 19, verse 15, when the Israelites were going to gather around Mount Sinai, which Moses would then go up to speak with God. God required them to be clean, and one of the requirements to be clean that he noted there was that the men could not have slept with their wives, because that would make them unclean. So Ahimelech is saying here in chapter 21, basically, if you have kept yourself clean, if you have done everything that is required of a priest to operate within the tabernacle, then I will allow you to eat of the bread. Problem is, though, even though David and the other men may be clean in the same way that the Levites are clean, Ahimelech did not have the authority to give David the bread. And obviously, you think about religious matters, we talk about authority a lot, because everything that we try to do as Christians is we try to do what God has given us the authority to do, because God's not happy when people do things that he has not given people the authority to do within religion, right? And that's why we don't use musical instruments, right? That's why we don't do certain things that maybe other denominations do, because we try to emphasize the authority of God in what we do and have Scripture for that. But Ahimelech, even though he's a religious man, at the end of the day, he doesn't have the authority to do this, but yet he goes about and does it. David participates in that. So verse 5, David says essentially that we're clean. David answered the priest and said unto him, of a truth, women have been kept from us about these 3 days since I came out, and the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in a manner common, yea, though it were sanctified this day in the vessel. Now I'll go ahead and read verse 6. So the priest gave him hallowed bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread that was taken from before the Lord to put hot bread in the day when it was taken away. So David basically says that his men are clean. Now we keep in mind David is basically serves in the military for Saul, right? We've seen that over and over again. And part of the reason why this is important to know is that if we turn to Deuteronomy chapter 23, we read about what the Israelite men had to do during times of war or on military campaigns. And naturally, that required them to be away from their wives. So Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 9 through 14. All right, so this is talking about sanitation, especially within a military camp. All right, so Deuteronomy 23, beginning in verse 9. When the host goeth forth against thine enemies, then keep thee from every wicked thing. If there be among you any man that is not clean by reason of uncleanliness that chanceth him by night, then shall he go abroad out of the camp, but he shall not come within the camp. But it shall be when evening cometh on, he shall wash himself with water, and when the sun is down, he shall come into the camp again. Let me see. Right, so the point here is that if you were unclean, the point was in military matters, there was a focus on making sure that the camp was clean. And so by logical process, right, if sleeping with your wife made you unclean, that meant that when you served in the military, you could not go back and sleep with your wife. Otherwise, you would make the camp unclean. So David, naturally in verse 5, this is where knowing the law of the Moses comes into play. David certainly knew it. You know, obviously, if they're on a military venture, which may be what Ahimelech is thinking, David and the soldiers would have known that they could not have done that to begin with. Right, and so David says we've kept ourselves away from our wives. This also helps us understand in 2 Samuel 11. You remember when David slept with Bathsheba, they conceive a son. David wanted Uriah to come in and to sleep with his wife. But Uriah did not do that. And we talk about that a lot because we think about Uriah's devotion to the armies of Israel. And that's true, but something that we also connect with that is that if Uriah had gone in and slept with his wife, he would not have been able to go out and fight with the Israelites the next day by the law of Moses. And so hopefully you see why, knowing, even though Leviticus and Numbers and Exodus, Deuteronomy, all those things may be boring, but at times, but whenever you can connect it to events like this, I think it helps us appreciate and understand it maybe a little bit more. So David, and that's interesting because David's obviously concerned about, keeping those regulations within the law of Moses, but when it came to eating the table of showbread, he sort of throws that expectation out the window, right? And there's a point within that too about we as Christians, when it comes to observing the commands of God, God doesn't want us to observe certain commands. He doesn't want us to observe the commands that we like. He expects us to observe everything, right? That He has given us. We can't pick and choose what we want to observe, but unfortunately, this is what happens with David. Nevertheless, David's unclean. Now, you note here again that the table of showbread, verse 6. The word for showbread, it can also be translated as presence bread. And the reason why it's called the showbread is because Exodus chapter 25, verse 30 is that this bread always had to be within the presence of God. So literally, present bread was bread that was presented before God, or it's called showbread because the bread was shown before God within the tabernacle. That's why it's called that. Now, we note one thing that's of interest to us, Leviticus chapter 24. You can read more about the table of showbread there. We're not going to necessarily look at that in particular tonight, but on the table, if you were to walk into the tabernacle and you saw the table of showbread, you would see 12 loaves of bread, 6 per row. So you had 2 rows with 6 per row. Within each loaf, we're told that there were 12 cups of flour. Now, to give you an idea, in a normal loaf of bread that you go and buy at the store, from what I understand, that has about 3 to 4 cups of flour within it. So the loaf of bread that's being talked about here has 3 to 4 times more flour in it than what you would see when you go in a store. Now, obviously, their bread didn't have yeast in it. But if you're thinking about, what does this look like? You think about a loaf, you have an idea, but probably a lot bigger than what we would imagine is the idea. Nevertheless, this is what Ahimelech has. Verse 6, Ahimelech allows them to eat the bread. Now here's the exemption or the when it came to eating of the showbread, here was the rule on that. And you can find this again in Leviticus 24. But obviously the bread had to be changed out every week. And it was changed out on the Sabbath day. And that's what David is pointing out. That's what the priest recognizes. For there was no bread there but the showbread that was taken from before the Lord to put hot bread in the day when it was taken away. So we know that this is the Sabbath day. And we know that from when Jesus talks about it in Mark 2 and in those accounts. So on the Sabbath day, the priest would go in and they would change out the showbread. At that point, the priest could eat the bread. Obviously, if you leave bread out for too long, what happens to that bread? It goes bad. Sometimes it can harden, right? And it's no good to eat. And so that had to be done, right? That was one of the jobs of the priest. And that's what David's pointing out here, right? Well, this showbread, it's run its course. It's time to change. Why not just take it off the tabernacle, or take it off the table and just give it to us? Because you're going to have to replace it anyway. And that's what happens. Now, I think this is sort of interesting to think about. What does it mean for something to be holy? The word hallowed there is connected to the word holy. Right? Bread's not holy because it actually has holes in it, right? That's not why bread is being referred to as hallowed or holy bread here, right? You think about what does it mean to be holy? Because it's interesting to think about that bread that was sitting on the table, 2 seconds later after it's taken off, it's no longer holy, right? It's common bread. That's what David and the priest recognize. It's common or it's ordinary bread. When 2 seconds ago it was holy bread. Couldn't be touched, right? And that's an interesting idea when you think about what does it mean to be holy, because it shows that when we think about what does the word holy mean, we have to think about the purpose of God, right? Think about other examples, right? Exodus chapter 3, verse 5, when Moses was standing before God at the burning bush, what did God say about the ground that Moses was standing on? It was holy ground, right? Was that because the ground was better than other types of ground? Yeah, it's because God was there. And specifically, with the presence of God, God is calling Moses out at that point to deliver his people out of Egypt. And so God's purpose was connected to that. Exodus chapter 19, verse 6. God said that the nation of Israel, that they would be a what type of nation to him? They would be a holy nation. Did that mean that the Israelites were inherently better than the Gentiles or the other people that we've been talking about in the book of Amos? Were they inherently better than them? Yeah, they were a holy people because of the purpose that they had been given, right? It's not as though God hated the Gentiles because he called the Jews his people. It's not that he hated them, but it was in pertaining to his purpose. Not just that they were to demonstrate what the characteristics of God should have been to the people around them, but also because it's through the Israelites, through Christ comes, right? And that was the purpose of God, the salvation of man. Right? Exodus chapter 20, verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day and to keep it holy, right? The point being there is, when you think about the Sabbath day, it's connected to the purpose of God, right? And the purpose of God in that particular day was a day of rest, but it was also a day, it was a religious day for the Israelites, right? Because the word holy is connected to the purposes of God. When we think about today, we are, 1 Peter chapter 2 talks about us being a holy people. It's not because we're inherently better than other people. I don't know if you've ever been accused of this, but you've probably heard people say, that some Christians have a holier-than-thou attitude. And that's not really who we are, right? It's not that we're inherently better than other people, but if we're called holy, it's because we have submitted that we are following after the purposes of God. And so I think that's interesting to think about here. What does it mean to be holy? Sometimes we have an idea that we often don't think about the purposes of God when it comes to the idea of holiness. And that's what makes us holy, right? Is connected to the purpose of God. Obviously, if we're a Christian, we've been baptized, we've had our sins washed away, we're living faithfully, that obviously fits within the purposes of God. That's what makes us holy, right? And I thought that's something interesting to think about in the connection of bread, because how can the same object be holy 1 second, but then 2 seconds later it's common? It's not because of the inherent part of the bread, but what was the purpose of that bread? Same way that somebody can look at us versus someone who's a non-Christian, and obviously we're made of the same material. We may even look alike, but the thing that separates us from them in terms of holiness is because we're following after the purposes of God. And hopefully that's something that was interesting to think about in that context. So with that being said, are there any comments on anything that we've discussed through chapter 21 at this point?
Like Peter said, or God said through Peter, be holy, for I am holy.
Right. Of course, within God's inherent nature is the will. Obviously, God fulfills His own purposes, right? And that's what you emulate. Just as Peter said, or Paul said, to be a follower of Christ, as he was, because he was on that same line. All right. So verse 7. Now, verse 7. It's almost like we're given a sort of a side note here, but it helps explain a lot of things, especially when we read through chapter 22. Now, a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord, and his name was Doeg, an Edomite, the chiefest of the herdmen that belonged to Saul. Now, we have a picture here again of David who is in a hurry. But verse 7 gives us indication of why he might have been in a hurry, because there's a man named Doeg, the servant of Saul, that is present. In 1 Samuel 22, verse 22, that verse is important because David actually acknowledges that Doeg was there on that day. So it's not like David didn't see Doeg, but that Doeg was there. David saw Doeg, and perhaps that, in part, caused him to be very quick in what he was doing. All right, so looking at verse 7, now a certain man, again, that he was detained before the Lord. Now, obviously, you think about the word detain, what do you think about? Jail, right? Or you have the idea about somebody to be taken into custody. The word there just literally means to hold back. It could mean in that sense here that he was being held back maybe because of a discipline or punishment issue. But sometimes this could be said for somebody that was in the process of fulfilling a vow, right? And obviously you had a religious obligation to keep it. Again, the phrase detained before the Lord gives you the purpose there. Maybe he's being disciplined for religious reasons. Maybe he's trying to fulfill a vow. You remember in 1 Samuel 10, verse 8, that Saul was told to go to Gilgal and wait on Samuel there. And in that sense, Saul was being detained for the Lord because he was waiting on Samuel. What's important here is that he is there. He is connected to Saul, and that David is afraid that Doeg is going to tell Saul about where David's located, which David's fear at this point on that is going to be justified, as we'll note next week. Now, you note again that Doeg is an Edomite. Something that might be helpful to keep in mind, Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 7 through 8, it tells us that an Edomite could be present in the congregation of the people of Israel. And so he could be with any other Israelite outside the tabernacle. Often we think about the tabernacle, we think that only the Jews, those people by birth, could be there. But Deuteronomy 23 tells us that even the Edomites could be there. And so it just indicates to us that Doeg was there, and that it's not like it was a crime for him to be there. He had the ability to be there. Nevertheless, David's afraid, right? So David said to Ahimelech, we're looking at verse 8, David said unto Ahimelech, and is there not here under thine hand spear or sword? For I have neither brought my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste. And the priest said, the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom thou slewest in the valley of Elah, behold, it is here wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If thou wilt take that, take it, for there is no other save that here. And David said, there is none like that, give it to me. So David naturally doesn't have his weapons, right? It's obviously urgent business, but if you're a military man and you don't bring your weaponry with you, not a good look, right? If you're a carpenter, you don't bring a hammer, a drill, a saw with you. You know, if you're a teacher, you don't bring your books with you. You know, if you're a cook, you don't bring your utensils and stuff with you. Not a good look, right? Yet David does not have his weaponry with him. So obviously he needs to defend himself. Verse 9, he inquires of the priest, and it turns out that the sword of Goliath is kept there. Now we note in 1 Samuel 17:54 that David actually got to keep Goliath's armor, but it was just his armor, not his clothes. And generally at this time, it was not uncommon to take the possessions of a well-known king, or in this case, a well-known warrior, and to kind of keep it as a trophy. And that's what they had done with Goliath's sword. And that's all that was there, right? Ahimelech didn't have any weaponry on him, but that's what was there. That's what David wants to take. You know, David said, there is none like that, give it to me. You keep in mind that David has used this sword once before. When David killed Goliath, David took Goliath's sword and cut Goliath's head off with it. So David, you know, could very well say, there is none like that, give it to me. He's had personal experience using it. Now, a point of application we could think about here. You know, we've talked a lot about Saul's fear and how Saul's fear worsened and it led him to make a lot of bad decisions the further he got apart from God. Now, you know, we obviously know David's not perfect here. And part of the reason why Jesus brought up that example in Mark 2 was to point out, you know, David was not perfect, whereas some of the Pharisees held him to that level at times. David's not a perfect individual, but right, he was anointed by Samuel to be the next king. He had God's favor, and yet David still finds himself dealing with fear. Right? We wouldn't say David's an unrighteous man like Saul was, but yet David still had to deal with fear in his life. You remember what David said to Goliath in 1 Samuel 17:47? He said that God does not save with what? God does not save with sword and spear. Now you look at what David's wanting here, right? He wants Goliath's sword. Now I think that's really interesting to think about, because David's a good man, but yet fear got to him, right? Worry, anxiety got to him. And you really see it come out here, because David is wanting the sword of Goliath when just a few chapters before, when he didn't have that worry or fear, he boldly proclaimed that God does not save with sword or spear, right? And you wonder why does David's mind change that much? Well, I mean, you think about it, for us as Christians, do we ever have to worry about fear, anxiety, things like that? Yeah, I think we all do. At some point in our life, we all have to deal with that. It doesn't mean that we're not a righteous individual, but we at times feel, right, those emotions. David is in that position. He's a good man, but nonetheless, fear, it seems, is getting the best of him. He's already lied about his position, but it seems like his mind has gone completely away from what he said in 1 Samuel 17 about Goliath to now wanting Goliath's sword. So fear has a way of getting to us like that. Jesus talked about that in Matthew 6, about not being anxious, to think about the things in nature that God takes care of. Paul told the church in Philippi there at the end of that letter, a church that was doing a lot of the right things, don't be anxious. Because sometimes when we allow those things, we allow fear to get to us, not only does it sometimes take away from our trust in God, but it can also lead us to doing things that we normally would not do if we had a clear mind, right? David's not having to worry about Saul. Maybe he's not so desperate in doing some of the actions that he's doing in chapter 21. So we have to do our part to obviously we deal with that. It's a fact of life. We have to we have to think about how we handle anxiety and worry and things of that nature. We don't always handle it perfectly. David doesn't do that here. But there is a reason why Jesus and the writers of the New Testament talked about, dealing with that and how we overcome with that. Paul talked about prayer in Philippians chapter 4, because that's a great way to overcome those issues. All right, verses 10 through 15, we'll sort of read through it and begin, pick up in that next week. But David flees from Nob at this point. Verse 10, David arose and fled that day for fear of Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said unto him, Is not this David the king of the land? Did they not sing one to another of him in dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s? And David laid up these words in his heart and was sore afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. And he changed his behavior before them, and feigned himself mad in their hands, and scrabbled on the doors of the gate, and let his spittle fall down upon his beard. So you see you're going to see another example here, right, of what David does because of fear. But verse 10, David gets up, he flees to the city of Gath. Gath is located southwest of where David would be at of the city of Nob. Gath is a Philistine city. We know that at this point, this is where the Philistines reside. Later on in the book, David's going to work under the Philistines for a while as a soldier. But David is so well known that the enemies of Israel, the Philistines, know who this is, right? They bring up again the song that was sung about him. Saul has slain his thousands, David his 10,000s. Perhaps that gives us another indication of why Saul got jealous of David. Not only was David popular among his people, but David was becoming more popular than Saul, even in foreign nations. Note that they called David the king of the land. That is interesting. It's interesting to think about. David's popularity not only extended in Israel, but apparently people knew about him in Philistia as well. Nevertheless, though, David's still afraid. David laid up these words in his heart and was sore afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. What could be another way that we could say laid up these words in his heart?
Took the word to heart.
Yeah, he had it on his mind. The idea is that is all, when he heard these things, that is all David could think about. David was the one who killed all of these Philistines, right? If I'm the one who killed all these Philistines, what are they going to do to me? And that's what David was worried about. They knew of his reputation because of what he had done before. And even though he had the help of God within that, David, it says that he laid up these words in his heart. He dwelled on it, right? He was afraid because of what possibly could happen to him. So much so, verse 13, he gets out of it because he changes his behavior. He acts like he's mad in their hands. He scrabbled on the doors of the gate and let his spittle fall down upon his beard. I don't know if you've ever been around, or maybe you've seen that on TV, someone who is, for whatever reason, maybe doesn't have and does some of the things that are being described here. It's not pleasant to watch, and obviously it's not pleasant to be around. But the point at that time was that generally for someone to be acting like this, not just among the Israelites, but especially among these other people that lived around the Israelites, when a person acted like this, it was often connected to deity or a God doing or punishing an individual. Now, in the Old Testament, we do read about God basically causing a man to become mad, so much so that he dwelled like an animal in the field. And who was that? Nebuchadnezzar, right? Now God had a hand in that. God does not have a hand in this, right? You note here that David changed his behavior, but someone who acted like this, who didn't have who had, obviously we know today people that deal with mental conditions may have some of these issues, but when David's doing this, generally at that time people connected that to punishment from a deity, and you did not want to be around that individual, right? Just as it can be hard to be around those types of individuals today. Even though they may be suffering from a mental condition. But verses 14 and 15, Achish tells his servants, right, you see the man is mad, why have you brought him to me? Now, Achish, they saw the David that had slain the thousands and slain the 10,000s that was like that song. So you might think that they are pretty overwhelmed by how much David has changed. But Achish says, why have you brought him to me? Verse 15, have I need of madmen, or have I need of an individual like this, that ye have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? And the answer to that question is no. So David's able to get out of this situation because he acts, he acts in this way. But the closing thought that we think about tonight, two things really, right? Within the Old Testament, we keep in mind that, even the great men and women of the Old Testament, they were fallible. They made mistakes. David was not one, even though the same David that had the great confidence in 1 Samuel 17 is the exact same David in chapter 21 who is consumed with his own fear about his own safety, right? And that's one of the things about the Bible, that it shows the strengths and the weaknesses of all its characters, and that all pointing to the perfection that would come in Jesus. And again, a thing that we keep in mind looking at the life of David, we obviously all have to deal with fear and anxiety, not because we're like Saul and we're just wicked people, have rejected God, but even as children of God, we do have to deal with things that make us anxious, things that worry us, and we have to think about how we handle that, right? Because we want to handle it in the appropriate manner. And you can see throughout the Psalms, and there's some Psalms connected to this that David's going to later express regret in one of the Psalms. I believe it's Psalm 52, about what's going to happen in chapter 22. But how we handle those type of situations, that's something for us to think about as Christians. Because even great men like David could deal with it. Are there any closing thoughts or comments that you'd like to add on to what we've discussed tonight?
David said, of Goliath's sword, there's none like it, give it to me. It'd be great if everybody had that attitude toward the sword of the Spirit.
Right.
The Bible, there's none like it, give it to me.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. If you didn't hear, listening online, Brother Wayne just brought up the point that just like David thought that Goliath's sword was so great, it'd be great if Christians would constantly say the same thing about the Bible, which is indeed the sword of the Spirit. With that being said, we'll go ahead and stop tonight. Thank you for your time and thank you for your attention. We'll pick up in 1 Samuel 22 next week.